said...
Before we start, Ms Richards, let me just say something about what we would have been due to hear tomorrow, but for reasons which are related to COVID, we will not be in a position to hear the statistics report and experts tomorrow. It'll going to be rescheduled for those who particularly wanted to hear it. I imagine most people probably do. In November, the exact date will be confirmed later. I'm sorry about that, but this is out of anyone's control, and we just wish those involved well. Thank you.
And just to say, so we will obviously be hearing the witnesses scheduled for Thursday and Friday, as per the current timetable. Yesterday afternoon, we were looking at the section of your report which identified a number of weaknesses in the current system for decision-making about health policy. And there are just three that I want to come back to. It's in your report, so perhaps, Lawrence, we could have the report on screen, EXPG 5047. And it's internal pagination 23, so page 29, I hope, electronically. Yes, and it's lack of long-term planning and preparedness and resource constraints. Now, in relation to the lack of long-term planning and preparedness, if we could go forward to internal page 29, please. And it's the passage at the bottom of the page where you have said this: the UK government struggles to think, plan and deliver projects in the long term. And you've identified a number of reasons in this section of your report. I'm not going to read it out, but they are pressure on resources, the focus on immediate political priorities, the shifting of political attention, and changes of personnel at both a political and administrative level. I think that's an accurate summary of what you there set out. Does the panel have any suggestions as to how that situation could be addressed and those weaknesses in terms of delivering projects in the longer term could be ameliorated or mitigated? Lord Bichard, I'll start with you.
Some of these pressures are inevitable in the sense that the media and the public move on to new issues that they're concerned about, and therefore take the focus on the long-term issue that you're trying to deal with. Some of them aren't. Some of them are actually self-made. If you have a culture where, as we were saying yesterday, civil servants are moved in the middle of a long-term project because it's good for their career to get experience elsewhere, then you're going to have problems because someone else is going to come in, have to learn what the project's about, and you get disruption. The same can be said for politicians. Does the Prime Minister, when it comes to a reshuffle, put more focus, attention on political patronage than on, I need to deliver, we need to see that project delivered, I will keep that person in place? So it's a mindset, really. I can't honestly think that any Prime Minister in recent times has sat down at the time of a reshuffle and said, well, I've got these three big projects and I need to keep those people in place if they're going to be delivered. It's usually about political patronage and how it's going to be received by the public. So some are self-made, some aren't. If you dealt with the ones that are self-made, the problems that are self-made, you'd go some way to dealing with these issues, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Professor Pollock.
Well, I perhaps take a slightly different tack, which is that the government has had a long-term plan, which is around an ideological commitment to breaking up the NHS, its privatisation, marketisation, and it's delivered projects through that, such as the Private Finance Initiative, but culminating really in the 2012 and the 2022 Health and Social Care Act 2012 and Health and Care Act 2022. So really, if we're serious, we really need to look at what kind of system, what are the values that underpin the system, and then how do we put a system in place which will reinstate the NHS. because now that the duty on the Secretary of State to provide key services throughout England has been removed, that is why we're in the situation we are in now, with no workforce planning, with no strategic planning, and of course no ability to coordinate because of the fragmentation and increasing autonomy of providers, which are increasingly private outsourced providers as well.
So would it be right to understand from your answer, Professor Pollock, and if we look at it at a more general level, that you're suggesting that governments are capable of long-term planning if they are sufficiently committed to the specific objective?
They're absolutely capable, and we know that because that's how the NHS was created in the first place, and that commitment was there from the civil servants and the ministers for at least the first 20 years of the NHS. But the commitment shifted because of this ideological position to breaking up the NHS and dismantling it. Now, that's taken a long time. It's really been happening since the late 1980s and the Big Bang of the 1990s. That's been incremental, evolutionary change, but that has been a long-term plan. Now, if the government really was committed to the NHS, it would then bring forward legislation which would reinstate the NHS and the structures that are necessary for area-based planning, workforce planning, and service planning.
And Ms. Salters?
So I don't want to cut across your train of thought, and in some ways I don't disagree with your analysis, but in other ways I think that attributes a lot more strategic planning capacity to those with those particular ideological designs than maybe there. I think a lot of the changes are short-term reactionary things. I think as a society we don't think about the long-term. We think about how can we solve the immediate fix we're in, and we might approach it in a particular way because of our general ideological slant. But I don't think people really are thinking 40, 50 years down the road. They're thinking, well, that will sort of edge us a little bit towards this, rather than what something like the health service needs, which is really serious. What is our 50-year planning horizon, and how do we get to that, and how do we continue to make steps to that? And I don't think as a society we're good at it, and I don't think the government systems are good at it.
And are there ways in which the government systems in that regard can be improved? I mean, in terms of, if we take the kind of longer term projects that perhaps the inquiry is interested in, which would takes us back to the 1970s and ideas about self-sufficiency in blood products, and I'm not inviting comment on that specific issue, but how does something like that, which is not necessarily an ideological commitment or necessarily a party political commitment, but is something that requires to be handed over from administration to administration in order for it to be fulfilled? How is that possible?
Well, look, even an ideological commitment, I would say this as a bureaucrat, wouldn't I, needs to be managed to delivery, right? And I hear what you say about ideological change. I don't think anyone will claim that it's been efficiently managed. It's just been a vague vision. And I think if you're going to deal with the issue you've just referred to, then we don't just need vague visions because they get lost when people leave or administrations change. You need a very clear vision with objectives and milestones that I'm sorry if this sounds a bit kind of boring and managerial, but you need the milestones to tell you how far you're getting down so that if someone else comes in, you can hand the whole project over to them. Another very important issue, I think, is that the civil service has never really valued delivery. The civil service values policy. And people who come in to manage or to deliver are often second-class citizens in the civil service. And I'm afraid that is still the case. So you need to get the skills to deliver. You need to value the people that deliver. And we've never really done that.
Well, I just want to add that I think, again, it comes down to political commitment, because in the 1990s, when private finance initiative was taking off, 3 hospitals were being closed for every one that was being built, with about a third of the beds being lost. When we raised this, Frank Dobson responded with a national bed plan and a plan to increase the number of beds at all levels, including intermediate care beds. Once he left, that plan completely disappeared and evaporated, and the beds continued to close at a terrible rate, which is why we're in this situation today with people waiting 72, 84 hours for a bed. But also, the structures were there for things like workforce planning. It's because we've removed all those structures from the system. It's not to say this is just all the fault of the civil servants. This is a political decision to remove the regional health authorities, which had responsibility for workforce planning, for service planning, and for the coordination. So there was a really important technocracy of important, valuable skills that were embedded in the health service, and they included estates and architects departments, workforce planning, and that including IT, but that technocracy has been increasingly just completely dismantled and destroyed. The expertise that's been there has been completely devalued and ignored, and it's been replaced by management consultants, often 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds, with really little know or expertise in the technocracy and the commitment long-term to building that technocracy and infrastructure. And that technocracy was really important because it was identified very early on with the first hospital plan, Powell's hospital plan, that there weren't the estates departments, there weren't the surveyors, and they needed, or the legal departments, and they needed to put all that in place. So it's been built up over decades and now dismantled since 1990 onwards.
Can I then link the issue of long-term planning or weaknesses in long-term planning to the issue of resources, which is the other point that you've identified on page 23 of your report. Now, I'm not going to invite a prolonged discussion on the overall funding or underfunding of the NHS, because I think we'd probably be here for the rest of the day. But you've identified in your report two aspects of funding in relation to the NHS that could lead to improvement. The first is a longer-term funding commitments, rather than it being for only a few years at each time. And then the other, I think, was to have flexible pots of money that could be used for specific projects or specific objectives as they arose. If I ask you, Ms Salters, because you talked about the need to plan for decades rather than just looking in the short term, how would those kind of funding proposals help the situation?
Well, I suppose if you've got something that's earmarked and can't be pulled away from, the money is there to do it. I would say, though, it isn't just about the money. And having something that's long-term earmarked on the funding front is great. It's about the human resource, the technical resources that Professor Pollock is talking about, the delivery skills, and actually the right policy skills. I mean, I think as the civil service has improved in valuing delivery skills, there's a way to go, but you're not necessarily always putting your best minds on the behind-the-scenes long-term planning, because you want to use your best minds to solve the short-term problems. So it requires a really different attitude to managing your human resources, to make sure that you're putting the right people thinking about problems that need to be managed over a 50-year timescale, as opposed to how are we going to deal with the crisis that's blown up in the news this morning. And that requires both policy and delivery experts to be devoted to that, and not to have their careers disadvantaged by the fact that they've been put on a long-term project. And it sounds very selfish to talk about managing people's careers, but people are entitled to want to do the best for themselves, and to be sidelined whilst lesser colleagues progress because you've been put on a long-term project because your expertise is valued there. You're not going to get the best people staying there because there's no incentive to do that. You need to provide incentives to do that. And all of that requires huge change in the way the civil service looks at managing things, huge change in the way politicians look at how they want to deploy their resources. You've got your brilliant star of the department. Are you going to put them away in a cupboard planning for 50 years that's out of sight, out of mind, but is hugely important? Or are you going to want them sorting your problems on a day-to-day basis? Those are difficult decisions to take, and if money's limited and if humans are limited, you'll make the short-term decision because that suits you as the minister or the permanent secretary better than than what's in the long-term, perhaps tedious, boring interest of the country, but it is still really important to do. That might have been a more garbled response than you were
That's
hoping
fine,
for.
thank you. Then can I just pick up on one of the points earlier and from yesterday about this issue of political patronage? That requires a very significant political, cultural shift in thinking. If the idea is to be, rather than these are my supportive political colleagues who I'm going to reward with a post, and shifting to an idea of this is the person who has the skills best suited to this post, and I'm going to keep them there, assuming that my government remains in power for a prolonged period of time to enable them to get on top of the brief and master it and deliver. How do we achieve that shift in political culture?
I think you will only achieve it if you have a Prime Minister who believes that that is important. And you know, that's not been the priority for a very long time. And I think if you don't do it, you see, not only do you have problems in delivery of long-term projects, you also have problems in terms of the effectiveness of a Secretary of State or Minister. If you move them around as often as we do at the moment, many of them are not in a position to take control of that department because it takes them 15 months to kind of get their heads around it, and then they're gone to somewhere else, which is why there is such an emphasis on short-term delivery, why there's such an emphasis on reorganisation of structures, because you can go to the press and the public and say, look what I did. It'll be another 3 or 4 years before anyone realises it had no real impact, or if it had an impact, it was negative. So it's a mind shift in terms of the people who are in control of the allocation of posts. And as I said yesterday, we have had once or twice in recent history a determination from the Prime Minister to keep people in post for longer, 97 to 201 being, I think, the best example. And having been there at the time, I feel that was quite a positive, it was quite a positive asset. If you are, also, if you put people in posts who know nothing about the issue, they really are vulnerable to being manipulated. I use that word kind of in a considered way by the civil service. If you come in to run an education department or a health department and you've not thought for a long time about what you want to do, what your vision for health or for education is, there are a lot of people inside the department who've got their own views about that, and they will impose them on you, and you won't be in a position, I think, to deal with that. So for all these reasons, I think you need a shift of priority at the most senior level in government.
And even if I can come in on that, even if you don't take the sort of malign manipulation view of things, maintaining a lot of good continuity, it makes it much easier for someone to come in and learn because they've got people around them who are experts and can help them. If you've got everybody who's been shifted around, you've sort of moved the chairs at the last minute. You've got everybody trying to learn together, and that's not a recipe for maintaining the type of corporate memory that is needed to keep functioning. I don't mean that things should always be done the same, but you need enough knowledge of the system to be able to make it work properly. And I think rapid recycling of people doesn't achieve that.
I think it's worth maybe thinking, maybe you don't want to go into this now, but these problems that Michael and Claire are talking about are replicated, I think, at the top of the NHS and within NHS trusts.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd need to have an executive here to talk about it, but there's the turnover of staff, and I'm no expert on this, but the annual funding cycle is a nightmare for getting anything done long term in the NHS. And, you know, funding, I mean, even sort of, I'm just thinking, I work with someone who organises training programs for crisis management for doctors. Hard to think of anything more important. It's always year by year, you know, she can't make a 5-year plan to educate all the doctors in the region because the money is always just about. Now, I'm no expert on the finances and the accounting, but if a hospital had a 3-year, 5-year settlement where they could actually do substantial things, and a lot of improvement and innovation is terribly hard to get going. There's lots of reasons for that, but it's particularly hard to sustain over long periods. And if you want to do something like for instance, sort out the referral process for cancer patients in your region. A very big influential thing. Very hard to sustain that, to get the people committed in place. And a lot of the things we're talking about, I think, some of it's at government level, obviously, but there's some very big and substantial programs that, need to happen slightly lower down where you get the same kind of difficulties.
Yes.
Well, I just want to add that a lot of these difficulties have been compounded by the market contracting. So the annual contracting round where the foundation trusts and trusts enter into contracts, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of contracts are being negotiated every year. Now, increasingly, because of the 2012 Act, these are now with private for-profit companies. Many of them are large American corporations, international global corporations. But now the government is removing some of that requirement, allowing rollover of contracts. So there's a danger in that as well, because increasingly the ability to plan within the system itself has been dismantled. So it's very difficult to know how you can put any planning back. I mean, you mentioned regions, but there aren't regions. We've got integrated care boards. I don't know how many of you know about these, but there are 42 of them. But they're not area-based organizations. They're not contiguous. They're membership-based, and that's on a very different footing. And similarly, the foundation trusts are competing against each other all the time for services, for patients. They're merging. The last thing in their mind is the needs of the local population and local services. They're there to make surpluses and to build their empires increasingly.
I'm going to move...
I knew you wanted to disagree. I think that's taking it a bit too far and suggesting that they're not interested in their local population. I think that's unfair. And I'd also
have to ask them then, what is their local
I'd also have to say that I think it's entirely within the rights of a government to make a decision about contracting out and outsourcing. People may not agree with it, but it's entirely within their gift to do that. And I think what we're talking about more here is not the ideological decisions, but the way in which that's carried through.
I'm going to move to, because there's a lot still to cover today, I'm going to move to one of the other areas in this part of your report that you've identified as an area of weakness, and that's the issue of inadequate monitoring and reporting systems. We can pick that up, it's page 22 of your report, but if we pick it up from the Cumberledge review, which you've referred to, Lawrence, it's RLIT 000174, please. This is the first Do No Harm report of the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review. And if we just turn to page 13, we can see the findings of this review at 1.16 refers to the lack of vigilant long-term monitoring. And then this observation, its absence means the system does not know the scale of the problems we were asked to investigate. And then there's a number of examples set out. So the first paragraph, the system does not know, so neither do we, just how many women have been treated for, and then reference to specific conditions and devices. And over the page, we see in relation to the other matters under investigation, paragraph 2, the system does not know, so neither do we, just how many women over 4 decades took sodium valproate. And then subparagraph 3, the system does not know, so neither do we, just how many women took a hormone pregnancy test, such as Primados between the 50s and 1978. And then if we just turn to page 59 before I ask you about this. Paragraph 2.114, so the bottom half of the page. In the third line, this report records that the MHRA may only find out a device is being used in the UK if there is a problem with that device. So the Cumberledge review identified a problem with what was known and with the monitoring systems in relation to the use of medicines and devices. And as I understand the report, you have essentially agreed with the observations that were there set out. Is the panel able to expand upon how it is the case that the MHRA does not know what devices and medications are even in use in the UK? Why do we have that state of affairs?
I mean, I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone else does. And I think it was fair enough to quote
Yes.
the report as an illustration, I think, of this problem. But I certainly don't want to comment on what the MHA knows and doesn't know, or why the device is. I'm guessing, and it is a guess, that the regulation of devices is not as tight as those of drugs, where you got much closer monitoring and testing and requirements. I would suspect that the requirements for usability testing of devices for just letting them on the market or used in hospitals is looser than you might expect perhaps in some other industries. But the other thing I was going to say was that this is an illustration, and there are other very important reporting systems within the NHS, particularly the instant reporting system, which is currently undergoing, where there are millions of reports of all problems of all kinds. So there are difficulties with it, but there are lots of other routes of information. Perhaps one of the other problems, though, is there are millions and millions of instant reports, but the resource to actually analyse and look at those reports and kind of track, and both within individual trusts and sort of collectively, is also a difficulty, I think.
Well, it may be that we can pick that up as an inquiry with the MHRA, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then there's an observation in the Cumberledge report. You've quoted it somewhere in your report. We can take that document down, about the healthcare system being disjointed, siloed, unresponsive and defensive. I want to come back to the issue of responsiveness and defensiveness when we look at recent patient safety initiatives later. But the Cumberledge report continued by saying the healthcare system doesn't realise that patients are its raison d'etre. Now, what I wanted to ask is whether the panel has any thoughts as to the extent to which that observation might be said to apply also to health departments, government health departments. Is there a lack of sufficient appreciation by the Department of Health and its equivalents in the devolved nations that patients are the raison d'etre? Does the human element get lost?
I think it's very easy to generalise about this, and I wouldn't want to do that, but I have to say that not just with health but across government, I've never found that there was a sufficient focus on whether you're talking about client, citizen, patient, as I said yesterday. There's a lot of talk about patient first, for example. If we were to achieve that, then it would require us to design our services involving patients at the beginning, rather than having some rather pathetic attempts at patient consultation and involvement when the decision about the policy has already been made. And I don't think that really exists. It's not just about patients, of course, it's about staff too, who should be more involved, I think, in some of the policy development work that goes on. I mean, it's not David anecdotes, but I was chairing the design council for some time. We spent a long time trying to get the health service to understand the power of service design, and in the end we managed to get them to commission us to do some work on bacteria in wards. And the first thing we found getting designers into that problem was that no one had really talked to the staff, no one had talked to the nurses, no one had talked to the porters, all of whom said, you can increase the cleaning rota in this ward as much as you like. It's going to have no effect upon the levels of bacteria because the curtains are the wrong material, all the furniture is wood, there are germs that get down, the mattresses, you can't tell whether they've been compromised. So the level of decision making wasn't involving the people who knew how to deal with the problems. And whether, as I say, whether it's patients, staff, whatever, I think we need a shift so that these people are involved and have power earlier on in the process.
And I'm going to come back to that when we look at that part of the report in particular. Yes. Professor Farrell. And then
I just want to say there is a lot of evidence around what constitutes a patient-centred approach. If you start from, for example, in many reports, if patients have been harmed in healthcare settings, lots of recommendations. If you start from that and work backwards, there's a lot of information around how to address this. It's not new, a lot of reports, but often there is a top-down approach rather than a grassroots responsive bottom-up approach to addressing the problem. Who's on the front line? Who's experiencing this? I'm sure if you spoke to patients and families who've suffered an adverse event or harm in healthcare, as Michael was mentioning, if you're talking to people on the ground, there is a lot of information, and there's been successive inquiries over decades now pointing to these issues. So it's not that there's not an availability of evidence, and I'm sure the inquiry is also looking at this as well.
So Professor Armstrong.
Yes, there are two outcomes, I think, which are important for patients. One is longevity, you don't want to die, and the second is quality of life. And in a way, healthcare is towards achieving both of those. The problem with quality of life is it's very difficult to define. So, for example, doctors will try and reduce your blood pressure or to fix your cholesterol level. That's their target, that's the outcome they're aiming for, with the assumption that that will then lead to better quality of life. So I think people in healthcare, right from the top to the bottom, are aiming at these sort of surrogate endpoints because they can't get at the key one, which is quality of life, because it's very difficult to measure and very difficult to achieve for different sorts of patients.
Professor Pollock.
Well, I was just going to come back to the system, which is what are the different mechanisms and routes that patients have their family to get into the system to make their concerns raised. And there was a lot of time spent trying to develop and design those mechanisms in the NHS. So that included through health boards, through local authorities, through joint consultative committees, but also through community health councils, which we touched on. Now, they were very strong in some areas and weak in others, but in their dying days, the Association of Community Health Councils of England and Wales had a report chaired by Will Hutton that I sat on, where we highlighted that the big problem was lack of government support and funding for them. But they had a direct route for the Secretary of State. They were able to raise concerns about lack of services, lack of provision, lack of planning, and that fed into the structures. But what we've seen over the last 30 years is the destruction again of this system for accountability to local people and their families, culminating now in the loss of area health authorities, really. So there are no mechanisms left apart from complaints route and PALS, which is toothless organisations such as PALS, and then there was Health Watch after it.
We're going to pick up on some of those themes. Ms. Salters.
I just wanted, I know you're keen to move on. I agree completely with what Michael says, that within government, it's much easier to focus on systems than on humans, and the civil service ministers don't get that right. But I wouldn't want the inquiry or anyone here to think that people within the civil service do not think about individuals and individual patients. Throughout my career, I've worked with lots of people who see the individual and the impact on the individual and realise that that's why we're organising the system as we are, because we're wanting to. We may not get it right, but the focus is on the individual and all the other individuals there. So it's not a bureaucracy that is completely bereft of feeling and caring. It's a different focus, and I don't think that's what you were saying, but I wouldn't want anyone to interpret
totally
it that way.
agree with that. I think the point I want to make is that I would like to see patients, clients, customers, staff, porters, whatever, involved at a stage when they can really influence the design of delivery and policy. I don't think the community health councils ever got to that stage. It's a different thing than commenting on what's gone wrong or even commenting on how things might be improved. It's a shift of power, and that's when I think there has been some resistance. But we're not talking about an uncaring bureaucracy at all. We're talking about people with good intent. It's just that I've said what
I'm sure we'll come back to this issue, if we may, later, when we look at the section of your report in particular that deals with patient involvement and with some of the organisations that you've referred to. So I'm going to park that for a moment, if I may. I wanted to turn to the section of your report that deals with devolution, and so I'm going to start by directing the first set of questions to you, Ms. Salters, but again, for other members of the panel, please to contribute. So in your report at internal page 31, I don't think we need to have it on screen at the moment, Lawrence, you've given us an overview of the picture, and I just want to summarise it and see whether my summary is accurate, and if it's wrong, please tell me. So if we just pick up the picture in 1948 with the creation of the NHS, what your report tells us is that there were 3 separate services then created: a service for England and Wales, a service for Scotland, and a service for Northern Ireland, with similar principles at that stage, but separate legislation. Is that right?
Yes.
And then in 1969, responsibility for healthcare in Wales transferred to the Secretary of State for Wales, supported by the Welsh office. But legislation and, you observe, therefore, core policy continued to be made on an England and Wales basis.
Yes.
And so you've described the position from 1969 onwards in this way: political devolution in Northern Ireland, administrative devolution in Scotland, and delegation of executive responsibilities in Wales. Could you just unpick those terms for us so that we can understand what that means in practice?
So, administrative devolution I would characterise as the system being a separate system. It's been set up, on a different legislative basis, operating as itself. Executive delegation is about within a single system, giving one person responsibility for managing a chunk of it, but still with the legislation and the overall framework and policy determined centrally. Political devolution is a step further than the administrative devolution. You have the system set up separately, but accountable to a different political entity. So in that case, the Northern Ireland Parliament of its day was the legislature, and the Northern Ireland Cabinet were the ministers who were responsible for running the health service in Northern Ireland in the 1940s and 50s.
And so the next chronological milestone that you identify in the report then is 1972 in relation to Northern Ireland, when the political devolution you've just described collapsed, and there was the imposition of direct rule, and health became the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, supported by the Northern Ireland Department of Health. Is that right?
Yes.
We've talked already then of the 1974 reorganisation, and our focus, I think, earlier has been predominantly on the position in England and Wales. But you've told us in this section of your report that there was at that point in time, you have then the regional health authorities in England and Wales, 14 of them, in Scotland, 15 health boards, and in Northern Ireland, 4 health and social care boards. Is that correct?
Yes.
I have to ask you again because the transcript doesn't pick up a nod.
Oh, right, I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you. And then you've told us that over the next 25 or so years, health services remained administratively separate, and with the Secretary of State for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland not being answerable to the Secretary of State for Health for decisions in relation to health matters.
That's correct, and I think that's a really important point to understand when we're thinking about devolution, both current devolution and the system there. It's not that the Secretary of State for Health ran health across the UK and delegated some power of that to others. It was 4 Secretaries of State who were individually responsible for health, among other things, in their jurisdiction. The situation with Wales is slightly more different because of the policy and legislative integration, but Secretary of State for Health has never been responsible for health in Scotland or health in Northern Ireland, ever. And the systems have been separate, even when they're part of the same government. The reporting chain for everybody dealing with health in Northern Ireland was up through the Northern Ireland system, through the Secretary of State, eventually to the Prime Minister under direct rule. Similarly in Scotland, the reporting line was through the Scottish Office Home and Health Department, as it was then, up through the top echelons of the Scottish Office, as it was then, and to the Secretary of State for Scotland and on to the Prime Minister. It was not aligned to the Department of Health and the Secretary of State for Health. That doesn't mean they didn't work together, but accountability and responsibility were separate and have never been integrated.
And is that why you've told us in your report that there remained, at this point in time, and we're talking sort of 70s through to 90s here, a considerable degree of autonomy in both Scotland and Northern Ireland. And the report didn't mention Wales in that same sentence. And is that because at that point Wales didn't have the same degree of autonomy?
It didn't have the same degree of autonomy because policy and legislation was still done on an England and Wales basis. If you're nerdy enough to want to look through all the legislation, I can't imagine anybody would not be fascinated by it. But you would get legislation that's made for Scotland, legislation that's made for Northern Ireland, and legislation that's made for England and Wales as a bundle. That's how things would have evolved throughout the 70s through 90s. That's the system I was familiar with operating.
And then I'm just going to carry on with the whistle-stop tour through decades of devolution. We get to 1999, and you say, in relation to Scotland and Northern Ireland, the devolution settlements at that stage include the transfer of primary legislative powers. In Wales, it was a slower process, is this right, with the devolution of executive functions and then the transfer of legislative powers to Wales on a rolling basis from 2006.
Yes, what was said at the time was that devolution in Wales is a process rather than an event. It started off with executive devolution in 1999. From 2006, there was a rolling process of devolving powers, and then from the implementation of the 2017 Act, devolution in Wales has been put on a comparable basis to Scotland and Northern Ireland with the introduction of the reserve powers model.
So if we're looking at things as at today, healthcare is politically devolved in each of the four nations, with policy making and legislation on the overwhelming majority of health issues being the responsibility of politicians within each nation.
Yes, and I think the overwhelming majority is the important thing. Our annex that sets out stuff that isn't devolved is where the boundary lies on that.
Yes, yeah, and I'm not going to go through those, but we have that in the report. Now, the inquiry has seen relatively little evidence of ministerial involvement in decision-making regarding health in Wales and Northern Ireland in the period from the 70s through to the 1990s. And it may be that reflects simply an absence of surviving documentation, or it may be that it reflects the fact that the Secretary of State for Wales or the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, or indeed the Secretary of State for Scotland, were not dedicated Secretaries of State for Health. So they had a very wide range of responsibilities. Everything fell within their portfolio for that nation, of which health was but one matter. First of all, is that correct, what I've just said?
That is correct. And if I can put a little bit of flesh on those bones, the situation in Northern Ireland was different from Scotland and Wales because of the political situation. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland's focus was primarily on security and restoring devolution. That was the focus of the Secretary of State. The usually 4 junior ministers between them would have a couple of departments. For much of my time, health was paired with agriculture, both really, really big departments. One junior minister responsible for all of those. When you think of the equivalent in the Department of Health in London, you would have had Secretary of State and 3 or 4 junior ministers, all responsible for different bits of health, whereas we had one minister shared across 2 departments managing it. Slightly less acute in Scotland and Wales because they didn't have the security situation to manage. There was less devolved or less in the administratively devolved bracket, and it was easier for the Secretary of State to be slightly involved in things, but mostly you're dealing with people who are extremely stretched across too many areas to be involved in detail.
And you've said in the report that it was common for policy in England to be replicated across the United Kingdom. And why was that?
My personal view is mostly because of convenience. It's much easier not to reinvent the wheel, but to adapt the wheel to fit local circumstances rather than starting from scratch. Obviously, because all of the civil servants in all of those administrations, all of those departments were working for the same political government, you would expect the same political ideology to permeate everything that's being done. But the general pattern was something would happen for England and Wales in London, and Scotland and Northern Ireland would probably copy or adapt something like that in its wake. So you can see, if you look at the legislation, there's often a time lag while equivalent things are done, and Scotland and Northern Ireland would do that.
We touched yesterday on the position of chief medical officers, and the panel told us that there was a chief medical officer in each nation, and there was no hierarchy, so they were four equal partners. Would it be right then that if you were the chief medical officer for Wales, Northern Ireland or Scotland in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you would be expected to provide your own independent advice to the minister, albeit that the minister might be a minister who wasn't specifically a health minister, but a minister responsible for a whole range of issues?
That's correct, and not just advice to the minister, but also to officials within the department. So within the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, our chief medical officer would be advising the department, and that would be her professional opinion, not her as the underling of her equivalent in England.
And so if we leave aside the limitation in relation to Wales in terms of legislation, would it be right to understand that in principle, the Secretary of State for Wales, the Secretary of State for Scotland, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, in these periods that we're talking about here, so pre-1999, could set their own policy, could make their own decisions about what screening techniques to introduce, or what approach to take to perceived injustices. They could, in principle, do that, but in practice, for the reasons you've described, often they would follow the lead from Westminster.
I think that's broadly right in terms of the theory. Obviously, they were still part of the cabinet, and therefore anything that was going to require a significant deviation, there would be an expectation, there would be a cabinet committee discussion about that, and everybody would be bound by collective responsibility for that. But there wasn't an absolute requirement, certainly not that I was aware of, that you needed to follow everything rigidly to the letter. There was a certain degree of latitude, which is understandable for the very different geographies that you're talking about.
Now, again, in your report, you've identified, in response to the inquiry's questions, what might be said to be advantages and disadvantages of devolution. If we pick this up, perhaps at, if we do have the report on screen, it's internal page 33. So I think page 39, please, Lawrence. You described tailored decision-making as would it be right to understand these are potential advantages rather than necessarily actual advantages? Because although you've said tailored decision-making, you've also said common for a policy in England to be replicated across the UK. So it may depend on what period of time we're looking at. If we're looking pre-full devolution, it doesn't sound as though there was the scope for tailored decision-making in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to the same extent.
So not to the same extent, but there was a bit of adaptation. How do you make it work for a population that is geographically dispersed? How do you make it work for a population that is not on the same island as the rest of the UK and is dealing with a land border? So you would need to build in appropriate tailoring. With political devolution, there's much more scope for that. And then I think some of the others, headlines, I think, are probably then self-evident if we're thinking about the full devolution, more focus on health issues at a political level. So the advantage of having a Scottish or Welsh or Northern Irish health minister as opposed to a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland with this vast portfolio of responsibilities. Yes, and someone who is experiencing the health system that they're presiding over because they live there and their family lives there. And then other potential advantages or actual advantages: increased local accountability, agile decision-making, and scope for learning. Can we then go over the page just to potential disadvantages? There's just a couple of issues I wanted to pick up here. The first is in relation to lack of funding and the Barnet Formula. Now,
we've heard reference to the Barnet Formula from a number of witnesses in the course of the inquiry's hearings. Can you just tell us in a succinct way, rather than a mathematical way, what the principle is that underpins it?
So the Barnet Formula, as we said in the report, it predates political devolution, and it was devised as a mechanism for managing funding to what was then the Scottish office, the Northern Ireland bloc, and the Welsh office within the single party government. So instead of at your annual funding round, the Scottish office having to make multiple bids each year for what they wanted to do, which became a really bureaucratic process, the decision was taken that we would have a formula that would apply spending decisions that applied to the, for want of a better word, English departments, and a proportionate amount of that amount of money would be added to the Scottish office block, the Northern Ireland block, etc., so that you wouldn't have to make individual bids for things. So it was to allow proportionate funding to go through. I hope that's sufficiently unmathematical.
And then you've said in the report that this approach has significant limitations, as I understand it now, in the post full devolution world. Again, could you just perhaps explain to us why that's the case?
Yes, so some of those are disadvantages that predate political devolution. It's a blunt instrument. It's better than the annual funding bid, but if you've got a service that operates on where per capita funding is a reasonable way of assessing it, then you might have a reasonable way of doing it. If it's something that's geographically based, if you think of the size and shape of Scotland, roads maintenance in Scotland, or coastline maintenance, the coastline of Scotland is almost as long as the coastline of England. So apportioning money on a per capita basis is inadequate for the coastline. I know you're not concerned about the coastline here, but it's just to give an advantage. Per capita may not always be the best thing. The other thing which has become more acute since political devolution is the question of what counts as England-only activity. So to give another example that's not health-related, were the London Olympics an England activity or a UK-wide activity? And there are other less dramatic things like that, because it's only England-only activity that has the multiplier in the Barnet Formula. So there's a really political decision about what constitutes an England-only expenditure, and needless to say, that's dictated by the Treasury centrally, rather than something that people collaborate over, and there's always a dispute over that. And then increasingly there are conditions attached to funding, and Professor Pollock may want to say a bit more about that. So yes, there is the multiplier, but it has conditions attached to it. It can only be spent in a particular way that limits the discretion that's available to the devolved authorities.
Yes.
Yeah, I just add a lot of expenditure, of course, is outside of the block. So this is for the devolved parts. But the only other thing to say is it becomes really problematic. There is what's called the Barnet squeeze, and you've probably covered that. But the other problem is when Scotland and England diverge in their policies. So personal care is free in Scotland, all personal care, but also higher education for students who live in Scotland is free for the undergraduate degrees. So that also means that it's really problematic, because the government's funding things out of the block and it's not being adjusted for, compensated for.
And then
they may lose out.
The second disadvantage you've identified is difficulties with coordination. So increased devolution making coordination across the UK more challenging, and of course there may be difficult political directions, different policies, as Professor Pollock has just referred to. I think that's fairly self-explanatory on a general level. I wanted to ask you about the Joint Ministerial Committee for Healthcare, which was intended to be one way of ensuring a degree of coordination between the four nations in relation to healthcare and health policy. Your report tells us they didn't meet between 2002 and 2022.
Yeah, that's right. I think the idea of having the Joint Ministerial Council and its various intergovernmental committees was a good one. It does, however, create a layer of bureaucracy, and in a system that's working well, where you've got lots of informal communication between organisations, having a layer of bureaucracy is not necessarily helpful, because you're investing effort in the bureaucracy rather than just getting on and doing things. So I think in the early stages, and we've said in the report, it met a couple of times before 2002. So you're correct to say didn't meet for 20 years, but it only met twice in its initial period. That didn't mean there wasn't a lot of interaction happening, but that's because you had the same party in power in 3 of the 4 administrations, and the sort of groundswell of goodwill for Northern Ireland meant there was collaboration there at an informal level, at political level, which made it easier to collaborate at administrative level. So the fact that it didn't meet very often wasn't necessarily a problem, except when the politics started to diverge, because you then didn't have the mechanism that brought people together to talk about things, and it was easier to continue not meeting than to say, well, better start up this bureaucracy again with a party that we don't get on with in whichever other administration it was. With hindsight, it might have been better if it had continued meeting on a regular basis. As, for instance, the JMC Europe committee, that was the most active of the committees. Lots of coordination, including on health matters, about how to implement European directives across the UK in a joined up, not necessarily identical, but joined up and no surprises to each other way in how to negotiate. It would have been better to keep that going.
And then prior to 1999, so prior to the sort of political devolution, do you know what mechanisms were in place at a political level, first of all, so at a ministerial level, between the 3 offices, Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish, and the Department of Health? Or was it through cabinet meetings, essentially?
There would have been a cabinet committee that had responsibility for health issues. I can't remember what its name was, and the names of them changed over time. And ministers from each of the offices would have been represented on it. Normally, from the Northern Ireland side, it would have been one of the junior ministers who was the member, because they were the designated Minister for Health. Whether that was always a wholly health-focused committee, or whether it was Health and Home Affairs or Health and Social Care, Health and Social Welfare, that changed with each government, but there would have been a cabinet subcommittee that focused on health issues that all 4 of those departments were linked into.
The evidence the inquiry has heard from ministers has tended to suggest that there was, pre-1999, comparatively little by way of dialogue or discussions between ministers on, certainly on either on health-related matters generally, to be frank, or certainly on health-related matters as they are relevant to the inquiry. Does that surprise you?
Not really, no, unfortunately.
And again, is that a reflection of the fact that the Secretary of State for Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland would have had this multiplicity of different responsibilities?
I think it's partly a reflection of that. I think it's partly a reflection of the general societal attitude that England is the default. We see this in the news, we see this in daily conversation, we see it in, we even see it in our report, and we were really conscious trying to make sure we were clear about that. It's really hard describing 4 separate systems in a way that is not, that doesn't take up 11 billion pages and become incomprehensible for the reader. People don't think about things other than through the prism of England. If you're living and working in England, that's the focus you look through, and that's not right, and it's not accurate. But it is how society is. It's how bureaucracies are. So it's not just that the Secretary of State for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland had other responsibilities, as did their junior ministers. It's that British society, if we want to describe it that way, and particularly English society and the media and the elected government, saw health as a matter for the Secretary of State for Health, and the label suggests it, and forgot, as so many people forget, that there is an entire separate health system operating in Scotland, an entire separate health system operating in Northern Ireland, and variations on the health system operating in Wales with different local needs. I think politically, where you've got an overtly unionist government in Westminster, that may make it all the more acute, because you don't necessarily conceive of there being variations. I'm extrapolating and speculating a bit here, but I think this view of England as the default is a real problem, and very, very difficult to overcome. Yes, of course, the population of England is much larger than the other three, but the other three are distinct and have always been distinct, and that's why thinking about devolution as just being from 1999 onwards it's not about political devolution and different decision making. It's about having separate systems, and it's personally, I think it's right to have separate health systems and separate systems, because the societies are different, the structures of the societies are different. Even going back pre-First World War, the government in London recognised that the Hounds and Lands of Scotland were so different. They set up a precursor to the NHS in 1913, the Hounds and Lands Medical Board, because providing health services in such a geographically large and sparse populated area were so challenging that they were incomprehensible to the rest of the UK, that something needed to be done to look at that. It's right that you have separate systems, but you need society to recognise that's a huge cultural shift that goes way beyond just looking at health and the administration of systems. Apologies, I went on too much.
No, not at all. And then I think you say, yes, it's on page 35 of the report. I don't think we need to have it on screen, but it's for your reference, Ms Salters. You say that health had traditionally been low on the priority list for intergovernmental relations, until perhaps the COVID pandemic may have caused at least a temporary shift in relation to that. Why has health traditionally been low on that list?
At a political level?
Yes.
Personal view, I think it is seen as it's not a particularly sexy issue, and it's the way it grabs the headlines doesn't necessarily lend itself to a focus on a need for joined up decision making and thinking. It lends itself to, there is an issue we need to solve, but it's not necessarily this is something we need to solve together. I wouldn't want to give the impression that just because it was a low level for coordination at political level didn't mean there wasn't coordination and dialogue at an official level. And I think certainly while there were good political relations at the top of the administrations, there was really close co-working, as there had been pre-devolution, between departments, between civil servants.
Just at the civil service level, and again focusing really on the period between the 70s, 80s and 1990s, some of the evidence the inquiry has seen would indicate that representatives of the Scottish Office or the Welsh Office or the Scottish Home and Health Department would be invited to attend meetings, all of which appear to be largely held in London. So representatives would be invited to attend as observers. And sometimes correspondence documents would be copied to, again, civil servants, Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish offices. But with the lead, it would appear, being taken from the Department of Health in Westminster. And so it was almost a for information only, or follow this line. if that is the effect of the evidence the inquiry's heard, and it's a summary of some part of the evidence we've heard, is there anything surprising about that to you?
No, there's not, and I recognise that pattern. I think that's partly a sort of grabbing ownership of the lead and the England default thing. It's also partly a practical issue of resources. And we used to joke there were more people called John working on the particular area than we had working on it in Northern Ireland, and that wasn't a joke, it was true. And that would have been replicated across the piece. I think there was a recognition that the scale of the resource available in London was so great that reinventing the wheel from scratch couldn't happen elsewhere. There was probably also a view that the best people were in London, and therefore that was where the cleverest policy making places were. And that's not a reflection of the quality of the people who were working in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but it's a reflection perhaps of the extent to which they were known and rated, and the extent to which it's possible to shine and be brilliant when you're trying to cover 20 issues as opposed to one. So I think it doesn't surprise me, but there were a couple of different reasons for it.
And just to be clear, we've discussed the broad range of responsibilities the minister might have. The same would then be true for civil servants. So a civil servant within the Northern Ireland office might only be working in relation to health, but might have 20 aspects of health policy that they had to deal with, whereas their equivalent in Westminster might have 3 or 4, of which blood policy would be the prominent one.
Yes, that's right, although not Northern Ireland office, the Northern Ireland Department of Health.
Sorry, yes. Just one final point in relation to devolution, or to the section of your report on devolution. If we could put on screen, it's page 37, please. So I think it's 3 pages further on, Lawrence. Sorry, it's internal pagination 37. Thank you. It's the last paragraph on the page where you say this: maintaining constructive relationships has become even more challenging since devolution, as the administrations have diverged in political ideology and as we have seen increasing competitiveness between the parties in power. Tension at this level unfortunately often filters down, affecting engagement between actors across the health system. No amount of effective structures can compensate for a lack of political willingness to collaborate or allow officials to do so in the wider public interest. And then it's this last sentence I just wanted to tease out. Matters of public health and patient safety are, however, perhaps areas where party political rivalry could and should be put aside in the interests of the wider public interest. Is there much evidence, in your view, of a willingness for party political rivalry to be put aside in relation to matters of public health and patient safety, whether across the 4 nations or indeed internally within any of those nations? Or is that really a plea for the future?
So I think our reference to it in here is essentially a plea for the future. I think there is evidence from the COVID pandemic of better cooperation and collaboration than there had been in the period prior to that. And in that respect, I'm speaking as an outsider, having not worked in government since 2018. But from what I could see, looking inwards, there seemed to be better collaboration on that issue. Not surprisingly, because it's quite a big issue and so important to collaborate on that basis. But even so, you could still see tensions with decisions about when to introduce and when to ease restrictions being very jealously guarded by each of the administrations separately, rather than a sense of let's collaborate and work out what's best overall. And that might have been the right thing to do. I wasn't there. I didn't see the evidence, and there was definitely a geographical basis to COVID risk, and therefore being able to take local decisions was important. But so there was political will for that. Quite how much, and we've referred to that in the report. Quite how much that was maintained after the initial crisis, I think is an open question, and that's why our plea is in there. That things like patient safety and public health are too big to be the political footballs between the party in government and the party in opposition, which might be reversed in a different administration.
I'm going to, some of these issues we may come back to in our final session of evidence today, but I'm going to move to the next section of your report.
Well, before you do that,
yes.
I want to ask for the insight which you can, each of you give, in the light, in particular, of this discussion we've had on devolution, in which it has almost at times seemed that each individual devolved nation has, as it were, a silo within which its own health system sits. And the collaboration which you plead for in that last sentence still on the screen it's a plea rather than a reality. What I have to deal with, in part, in this inquiry, arises out of this evidence. In the 1940s, in wartime, it was plainly a good idea to keep the troops alive when they were fighting abroad, to be able to freeze-dry plasma, and indeed that was useful for civilian casualties too. And it was sensible nationally, or thought sensible nationally, to have two central manufacturing places at which this would be done. One was in Cambridge, the other was going to be up north. And up north turned out, significantly for this part of the discussion, not to be Newcastle, which would have remained south of the border throughout, but Edinburgh, which has remained north of the border throughout. And so you had two freeze-drying plants, which after the 1940s, and after the inception of the NHS across the whole of the country, by the whole of the country I mean the devolved nations as well, they began to develop a production capacity for albumin, for the immunoglobulins, and significantly for the purposes which I sit here, factor products. And so you had the two plants serving the UK. Of course, the one in Scotland tended to serve Scotland, the one in England tended to serve England. But in the late 1960s, when it was plain that BPL, the evidence I think that we've had in the inquiry so far, the Blood Products Laboratory, which had shifted from Cambridge to Elstree by this stage, needed investment. So also did the plant in Edinburgh. And the plant in Edinburgh attracted the attention of the department in London, covering the whole country, which decided it would invest some money which would, as it were, be above the money would ordinarily be derived from Scotland itself for this project, in order to build a bigger and better plant in Edinburgh, so that it could serve not only Scotland, but also the north of England, up north. Now, by the mid-1970s, where that plan had been energetically, so it might seem, pursued, at least when the blood transfusion service was under the control of Maycock, or he was the, as it were, the chief advisor to the Secretary of State on blood transfusion matters. He retired, and his post was taken over by Dr. Lane. And at this stage, the blood transfusion service and the blood production facilities were dealt with by different people. And At this stage, in the late 70s, the government in London, under David Owen, had declared self-sufficiency, national self-sufficiency, meaning, I think, the whole of the country, but we can argue about that, we can look at the evidence on that if necessary, would be a desirable policy to adopt, as he told this inquiry, in part, large part, for reasons of patient safety. That involved being able to supply the factor product needs for everyone in the country as best one could from the production facilities one might think in the country. But the plasma in England was sourced from the regions, and that fell within regional budgets. It wasn't, the production facility wasn't financed directly by those regions, even though it served the regions. And the view of Dr. Lane, as expressed, was that it was wrong for the regional English money to be spent to collect plasma to send to Scotland to produce product for England, albeit that was what the department had already spent quite a bit of money in financing, the ability to develop the Scottish plant to do that. And plainly, the Scottish plasma went to Edinburgh in any event, and there wasn't enough of that to supply the north of England, even if the Scots would have taken the view that it was appropriate for Scottish money to be spent to give the product to the north of England. The upshot of this may be thought to be that there was a shortage, so far as England and Wales was concerned, of available NHS-produced product, which, as it was thought at the time, might very well have been much safer for the consumer, for the patient, who is, after all, the focus of concern, one might have thought, had it been achieved. So it simply didn't happen. The Scots went on producing enough, largely, by and large, with some exceptions for themselves. Some product imported from America, England imported a lot. I put this very broadly to represent the problem. Now this, I'd be very keen to hear from your different perspectives the extent to which the structures by which health was organised contributed to this, and the extent to which they should not have contributed to this problem if they did. Because it involves, seems to me, the relationship between the centre and the regions. It involves the question of centre of government and localism and the regional financing in England. It involves the questions of devolution, which we've just been discussing. And I'd welcome any insight which you can give me from your perspective, bearing in mind that what may be attractive to those who are listening is to know whether and what better served patient safety overall.
Well, the missed opportunity was not creating a national blood transfusion service, in my mind. I don't know if that answers your question. So
well, it does. You mean a UK national?
It could have been UK, or it could have been one for Scotland or one for England. But at that time, a UK national blood transfusion service would have made a lot of sense.
Because collectively you make the point that there was no provision in the NHS Act of 1947
That's
to create
right.
a national blood service.
Yes. And if there had been, you wouldn't have had the problem. You'd have had a national blood transfusion service with funding, a proper system and systems and programs and expertise there. It could be organised, of course, through regions, but you wouldn't have had the problem of regions constantly battling against each other, battling for funding within the region. and this, issue of top slicing of funds and some regions being more successful than others in competing for funds for the service. So that, to me, is a big part of the problem, that lost opportunity.
And how would that have been achieved, given the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service operated under the management that it had at the time, had been set up separately in Scotland in 1940, compared to the one in England set up just a shade later?
Sorry, your question about how...
There were two separate systems,
yes,
the English and the Scottish,
yes.
pre-1947.
Yes.
Neither was, I think, on a statutory basis.
That's right.
But your solution would have one statute covering
you could have
the
had
UK.
two. You could have had two national blood transfusion services, one for Scotland, one for England. Wales is very small, but it would be England and Wales together. You could have done that. There's no reason why that could not have happened at a country level.
In my view, the problem of devolution simply magnifies the tension between the centre and the periphery of the NHS, which has always been there. So we've got central control from government in London or one of the devolved nations, but then people want to have a local service which is responsive to local needs. So the NHS is constantly trying to push responsibility, decision-making and so on out to the periphery where it can respond to local needs. Now, so, for example, regional health authorities were set up and area health authorities and so on to get the decision-making, get the resource put out there where local people were. But then this comes a problem when there's something which is national problem. And the tradition there is to top slice the money, which you've just described. You top slice some of the money for some of this resource. But there's lots of pressure groups throughout the NHS who want top slicing for their particular disease, not only for blood products, but there's lots of others. Should we top slice for cancer care? Should we top slice for diabetes care and so on? And by and large, the centre wants to resist this top slicing because it seems unfair on the rest of the healthcare system. So I think there's a permanent ongoing tension between centre and periphery in the health service, and devolution has simply magnified that.
I think I agree with both the comments that have been made. Excuse me. My additional perspective would be that when we talk about devolution, we tend to talk about it in black and white terms. And what we're never very good at, doesn't matter whether it's health or local authorities or just the organisation itself, any organisation, we're not very good at defining what it makes sense to devolve and what it doesn't make sense to devolve. If you don't do that at the outset, then you're going to drift into the kind of arguments that David Armstrong's just been identifying. When devolution took place in 1997, when the Labour administration came in with a clear commitment to devolution, there was a period of months when the discussion was exactly what is it that we are going to devolve here. Actually, the discussion was more, because of the Prime Minister's commitment to this, what are we not going to devolve? And there are a small list of issues which are not devolved. The economic strategy is not really devolved. So if you're not clear at the outset what you're devolving, then you're going to get into these sorts of problems. Some things it makes sense to devolve, some things it doesn't make sense to devolve, and you may well have identified one of those.
Professor Farrell.
I'd just like to add that in relation to the blood transfusion services, what you began to see in the 1990s was a shift towards a more national approach. You've got NHS Blood and Transplant, not completely national, but what you've seen is a build-up of expertise since that time about identifying national policy strategy versus how you're responsive, as David has pointed out, to local needs. And just as an exemplar of how that is taking place currently, in terms of a research project we've been involved in, we've been looking at, for example, the new deemed consent regimes in relation to organ donation and the impact of devolution. And you're looking at that build-up of expertise and how you manage the sensitivities across devolution while also promoting a national sort of strategic approach. So if you're looking at institutions and policy formation and how you respectfully handle that in relation to human tissue and patient safety issues while also handling the machinery of government, there are some current examples of how that might be managed while also reflecting on the past in relation to blood and blood products. And we're conducting a research project now with colleagues in Wales, but also covering Scotland and Northern Ireland to see how that is playing out in the area of human tissue, specifically looking at organ donation. But it's indicative of how you can, I would suggest, our preliminary research findings about how to manage those tensions. And certainly in relation to blood products, you've got multi-layers of personality issues, different manufacturing facilities at the time, but you've also got policy ideas that captured imagination around, and I'm not going to go into it, around self-sufficiency and, dare we say, sufficiency that are feeding into the mix. You've also got incentive opportunities in policy and institutional structures where, for example, the clinician can move within those structures to order in their blood product from the states, depending on funding arrangements in regional health authorities at the time, for example. So we must not forget about the role of the clinician as well in managing that process, particularly during the time in the NHS when, Professor Pollock will speak to this more about the golden age of clinicians as well, perhaps not so much now in terms of technocracy. But there are different actors involved, particularly in relation to the blood products, but also some examples that you could look to in terms of how to manage a more current approach to the sensitivities of devolution while also looking to patient safety.
Professor Pollock, and then
I just had one question, was whether the inquiry had the opportunity to look at other countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, which were the same size as Scotland, thinking about devolution in different, England and Wales and Scotland, and how they approached, how smaller countries also approached blood transfusion products.
Yeah, well, we have looked, have we not, Ms. Richards?
That work is still ongoing, and we propose to bring it all together in probably a written document that we make available to everybody.
And I was just going to add that my colleagues are far more knowledgeable on the actual operation of blood-related services than I am. But going back to your question about how the structures that existed in the early 1940s and then afterwards
through to really the 1990s.
To 90s, how those affected it. I think one possible issue is a lack of recognition from those funding the service that there were different systems in place in the different parts of the UK that they were spending money to, and therefore not setting the contractual arrangements that governed the investment in ways that properly identified who owned the product produced by the different institutions and what their obligations for sharing with. It comes down to, what do we mean by national? Do we mean English, Scottish? Do we mean Great Britain? Do we mean the United Kingdom? It's a word that we all think we know, but my definition may be different from others on this panel and everybody else in the room. And I think without precision about what we mean when we're setting things out and checking, there is a shared understanding about what jurisdiction applies and how the resource is to be used and shared beyond the jurisdiction in which it's situated. You end up with a problem, and that lack of consideration of that is born of, I would say, ignorance and the England default view of things, rather than trying to understand what the institutional realities are and have a contract that properly reflects those. But that is.
Can I just add a postscript, because I'm not sure it's relevant, but I'll put it on the table. I mean, what I was saying was that you need to think very carefully about what should be divulged, what can be divulged right at the outset, and what you should retain at the centre. I've been doing some work recently with a large professional organisation, institute, and they have been wanting to decide what to divulge and what to keep. They've decided, I think quite rightly, that standards, in other words, what you need to attain in order to be a member of that professional institute, cannot be divulged. It has to be across the whole of the organisation. It's an international organisation, and therefore they are retaining that at the centre. And I think too often we don't have that debate at the moment of devolution, which is why I think 1997 was quite an interesting case study, because, I say, over a period of 6 months or so, that debate was going on. May not come to the right conclusions.
It was having been peripherally involved in that, because of course that debate was about Scotland and Wales, because the decisions about Northern Ireland in effect had been taken in 1920 and then consolidated in the 1973 Act. And there was an interesting debate about the degree to which the discussion about Scotland and Wales should reflect the framework of the Northern Ireland settlement or not. But there was really quite extensive debate about that at the time. As you say, whether people ended up making the right decisions is a different matter. But it wasn't for want of trying to get it right.
Professor Vincent.
I was just going to develop the point Michael makes about standards, because I suppose we can think we're ranging across several different things. One is the organisation of services, which it makes sense to devolve locally because of all sorts of reasons. Then there's what you might call safety critical infrastructure, which I guess you could say separate out, as say blood products is one of those things. But even within that, I guess you could potentially, and I'm no expert on this area, but you could potentially have different suppliers. But what is absolutely critical is having standards and a regulatory infrastructure which is absolutely common to everybody at national level and possibly international level. And I'm thinking about, I suppose, commercial aviation, where there's lots of suppliers, but it's a very tough regulatory regime that's imposed the same everywhere. And so my questions would not only be about the supply of a product, of whatever it is going on now, which I don't know, but about what the testing is. And I'm guessing from what Claire is saying that people contracting this have got very little understanding of how you test for the safety of products, what routine checks are, and you need a specialist to know that you've got those people. But I think the supply and the regulatory side of it should be sort of thought of separately, if you like. And depending on one's faith in the regulatory structure, you might be willing to have different suppliers. Now, I don't know, but there are several things to separate out about whether it's national or local, I think.
Well, my observations, my request for insight sparked quite a lot of conversation, which I'm going to draw to a close now, because I think we need our break. But first of all, before we do have a break, Ms. Richards, is there any question that you want to ask which arises out of that exchange?
Not at present. It may be that core participants and legal representatives, when we get to our last evidence session later today, may have some suggestions that they would like me to consider. But for my purposes, nothing presently.
Well, let's take a break until 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock.